Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so used to saying good evening, but this is such a delight to welcome everyone to the Athenaeum here on this very, very chilly afternoon. So welcome. My name is Trisha Altman. I'm the Director of Programs and Engagement here. We are winding down our winter season. We just have a couple more events. I just want to highlight one of them for you. On Thursday, the 12th of December, we're going to have two authors, really spectacular authors, Joseph Earl Thomas, who's local, and Philip B. Williams, and they're going to be here discussing their two most recent novels. I think it's going to be a really great conversation. That's going to be at 6 o'clock in the evening. And then we're going to take a little break for the holidays and then come back with our new winter season. We're just getting the brochure out to the printer, so that should be coming out pretty soon. Events are already starting to come up on the website, so take a look. But it's my delight to welcome our speaker I almost said this evening again, this afternoon, Margaret Strawbridge Butterworth, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Justice Strawbridge, one of the founders of Strawbridge Clothier. And she's going to tell us the story of her family and her family's store, and I think it's going to be wonderful. So welcome, Meg.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to take a quick drink of water here before I get started. Sorry. Thank you so much for having me come and speak to you all about my book, Philadelphia's Strawbridge Clothier, From Our Family to Yours. It's a real honor to be here, and I've never actually been inside this building, a beautiful building, before, so it's a delight, and I'd love to take a tour of it afterwards. So before I get started, I always like to ask folks in the audience, please raise your hand if you used to work at Strawbridge Clothier or Clover. So we have a few. Anyone else? My mom's in the back and she used to work there too. Well, I will talk for a while, and then we'll open it up to some questions, and I definitely welcome folks who did used to work at the store to please, if you would like, stand up and share any memories that you have about your time with the company. It's always a real treat to hear from people who used to work for the store. So with that, I'll get underway. I'm often asked why I wrote this book. And there are a few different answers to that question. Like Tricia said, I am a member of the Strawbridge family. My great-great-grandfather was Justice Strawbridge, who was one of the two co-founders for the company. And my father was Francis Strawbridge. He was the chairman of the board when the company was sold in 1996. So I've known for a while that I wanted to do something to somehow honor the history of the company. I wasn't too sure what form that would take until December of 2019 when, there we go, I came back to Philadelphia. I live in Seattle, Washington, by the way. I grew up here, but I moved out to Seattle in 1997. So I flew back here to Philadelphia in December of 2019 because there was a City of Philadelphia historical marker that was installed in front of the former flagship store at 8th and Market Street, which many of you might be familiar with the historical marker. Maybe you've walked by it a few times or even read it. So I came back for that, and there was a special ceremony for the installation of the marker, and there were several former employees who came. And I was able to speak with a few of them and just hear their memories about what it was like to work for the company. And then shortly after that, I learned that there's a Facebook page for former Strawbridge Clothier employees and former Clover employees as well. So I became a member of both of the Facebook pages and just really enjoyed seeing what people have to post. And it's just been a wonderful way for employees to stay connected all of these years later, and also to reconnect as well. And people post old photographs of them when they worked for the company, and just share lots of stories. And I thought, well, this would be a really great way to try to tell the history of the company by capturing as many of these personal stories as possible into a book. So I ended up interviewing about 47 former employees of both Strawbridge Clothier and the Clover Discount Store division. And it was wonderful to get to know some of these people and learn what it was like to be part of the company culture. And I felt like not only was it a great way to tell the history of the company, but it was a wonderful way to honor the employees, because the company could not have been as successful as it was without the employees. I also feel like the story of Strawbridge Clothier is an important story to tell because it captures a pretty important piece of American history, which is something I came to better understand as I researched this book. And it wasn't that long ago when pretty much every city across the country had their big department store. And the department store was very much a part of that region, that city's identity, and really catered to the needs, desires, whims of that community. And as we know, retail has changed for better or for worse over the years. And I feel like I'm a Gen Xer, and I feel like folks in my generation and probably some older millennials are really the last generation to have vivid memories of what it was like to shop at your city's big department store. So I just feel like it's an important piece of history to pass down to younger generations. So with that said, I start the book in 1868 when Justice Strawbridge, my great-great-grandfather, who's pictured on the right, and Isaac Clothier, pictured on the left, signed a business contract on July 1st and opened the store at 8th and Market Street. And actually, Justice, I always like to point out, Justice had been in partnership with a different man earlier and had opened up a small dry goods store in 1861. Oops, wrong way. Which is pictured here, at that very corner of 8th and Market Street, so same location. And it's a small, charming, red brick colonial-style building that was called J.C. Strawbridge and Company. And that partnership ended, and so by 1868, he was looking for a new partner, and it made a lot of sense for him to ask Isaac Clothier, because Isaac had been a cloth wholesalesman and had sold his cloth to Justice at his small dry goods store. So the two men had already formed a relationship, a working relationship, but they also had formed a friendship, and they had a couple of things in common. They were both the same age. In 1868, they were both 30 years old, and they are also both practicing Quakers, and their Quaker faith was very important to them. So they signed their business contract, and in the summer months, they actually tore down that charming colonial red brick building and constructed a slightly larger 5-story tall building at the same location of 8th and Market Street. And that opened up in September of 1868. So from there, I follow the history of the company over the course of the next 128 years to when the company was sold in 1996 to the May Company, which is now Macy's Incorporated. And as you know, the store was a family-owned and managed business from beginning to end. And at the time of its sale, it was the oldest continuously family-run department store in the country. And because of that, largely, it built a family-like company culture. So anyone who worked for the company was considered to be part of the store family, capital S, capital F, the store family, regardless of your position. And I think this made Strawbridge & Clothier really stand apart from many of its competitors. This photograph was taken in the early 1990s, and it shows members of the third, fourth, and fifth generations of Strawbridges and Clothiers who were working for the company in leadership positions for the company at that time. And I think, it's pretty remarkable because generally speaking, a lot of family businesses are lucky if they make it to the second or third generation. And here we have members of the fifth generation who had decided to make the company their career at that time. I think also that Strawbridge & Clothier was a uniquely Philadelphia company. As we know from our American history, Pennsylvania was settled as a Quaker colony. And many early Quakers not only brought their religious convictions with them to the New World, but also their entrepreneurial spirit and opened up businesses. And when I was researching this topic, I came across a kind of a funny quote that goes, "Quakers came to America to do good and did very well." And many did, and Justice and Isaac did very well, and no qualms about it. They were pretty upfront. They wanted to start a business. They wanted to be financially successful. But at the same time, their Quaker values of simplicity, integrity, community remained very important to them and really did inform the way they ran their business. Isaac was quoted as saying early on that he and Justice built their business on the foundation stones of integrity and character. And it was important for them to stay true to those values throughout the history of the company, really. And I think these founding values would also be captured in the company's trademark image called the Seal of Confidence, which I think many people might recognize here. It was on display in the 8th and Market store and then later in all the branch store locations, and it was in all the advertising materials and marketing materials. And it was created in 1912. And it, I think it really served as a visual reminder to customers that they were engaging in a trustworthy transaction with the company. It's an image that was taken from a Benjamin West painting that shows William Penn shaking hands with Chief Tamanon of the Lenni Lenape tribe. And I know some folks might look at that image and think, well, I don't really think of the words trust, when I see a picture of a colonizer creating a treaty with an indigenous tribe. And that's definitely a fair point. And I would just say, I think in 1912, unfortunately, they weren't really thinking about that. And I did learn that, some of you might know this already, that this treaty with William Penn and the Lenni Lenape was actually known as the Great Treaty and lasted for 50 years, which I guess in terms of treaties is maybe a long time. Unfortunately, when William Penn died and his sons took over governing the colony, they weren't as respectful of the treaty and broke it, and we know the tragic history that unfolded from there. Anyhow, that's just a little historical side note that I like to share. But I think what the store really liked about this image was the handshake, because it kind of gave a suggestion of conviviality to customers. When the store first opened in 1868, it was small, and there were only 30 employees, and they had a small customer base. But Justice and Isaac knew a lot of their customers, and they would end each transaction with a handshake. Well, by 1912, the store had grown, and they had almost 5,000 employees and a larger customer base. So it's more difficult to end each transaction with a handshake. So I think that's what they that's what really appealed to them with this image. So I say in my book that Strawbridge & Clothier began its story in one century, and it ended it in another. So that's 128 years of doing business, and it's 128 years in our country's history. And a lot happened during that time that retailers like Justice and Isaac were able to benefit from. They started their business at a very opportune time. There were numerous technological inventions occurring at the end of the 19th century. The retail industry was growing by leaps and bounds, and as I mentioned before, pretty soon every country or every city across the country was, had a department store. They were popping up all over the place. And they were really meeting consumer demand for the increased availability of mass-produced goods and ready-to-wear clothing. In 1868, there really wasn't much in the way of ready-to-wear clothing. There was a little bit for men, but not so much for women. You had to go and buy cloth and fabric from a dry goods store and bring it home and make it. Or if you were wealthy, you had someone else make it for you. So after the Civil War, mass production of goods really picked up. And pretty soon, retailers like Justice and Isaac were no longer just selling cloth and fabric and some ready-to-wear clothing. They're now selling ready-to-wear clothing for women and children, furniture, carpets, artwork, lights, household supplies, garden supplies, toys. So because of this, you start to see the use of the word or the term department store become more common because retailers had to actually create departments, organize all of this new merchandise into departments. So the small dry goods store is on its way out, and the department store is now here. And this is also why you start to see department stores like Strawbridge's have to increase their actual footprint, their physical space, to better accommodate all of these goods. And Strawbridge's, really beginning in, I'd say, the mid-1870s, up until the early 1900s, underwent a series of expansions at the corner of 8th and Market Street. And this shows you all the different stages of the building at 8th and Market Street. So, Justice's original small dry goods store to the next images of the store when he and Isaac opened it. And then the third image was probably what the store looked like probably around 1890. So they were expanding into adjacent properties at the corner of 8th and Market Street, so really taking over that corner over the next few decades. And then, of course, the last image is the store that we all recognize that's there today, and that was built between 1929, I think it finally was completed in 1931 or 1932. So there are also lots of other technological changes that were taking place during this time that the store was able to benefit from, and I talk a bit about that in my book. Just to highlight a few, there was, of course, the invention of the automobile, which, when the store first opened, they really relied on horse-drawn carriages like the one on the right to deliver goods to customers at the end of the day. And then by the early 1900s, they were phasing out the horse-drawn carriages and were using delivery trucks like the one on the right. And that is pretty important because that allowed the store to reach more neighborhoods, more customers in the city and into the villages that were emerging outside the city limits, which we refer to now as the suburbs. So it allowed them to reach more people. And then there was the invention of the cash register, which by 1920, the store was really using cash registers for processing purchases. Prior to that, especially during the first few decades of the store, they relied a lot on child labor, actually. They hired boys and girls as young as 13 to be cash boys or cash girls, like the cash girls photographed here in their crisp uniforms. And they were hired to do a variety of odd jobs throughout the day, but one of which was to make cash for customers. So a customer would purchase their item with a sales clerk, and the sales clerk would call a boy or girl over and hand them the item and the money, and then the boy or girl would run across the sales floor to another location where someone was stationed to actually make change, and then also to wrap the item. And the boy or girl would run back to the sales clerk and give them the change and the item. So you I always like telling that story because you just envision on the sales floor at that time the flurry of back and forth activity with these boys and girls in their uniforms. running around. And I should note too that, these young kids who were hired weren't viewed by the store as just cheap, dispensable labor. The store hired them really with the intent to keep them with the company for the entirety of their working careers. And they actually established what was called a junior school. So depending on what grade level child left school, and when they came to work for the store, they were required to enroll in the junior school and pick up from where they left off at school. And that really was, like I said, the idea to keep them with the company, to give them opportunity to keep growing into other positions. And I talk a bit about this in my book about various employee training programs that the store established, especially they became quite popular during the 19-teens. And it really was this idea of keeping our employees with us and providing them with opportunities to continue to grow, to build their skills and continue to grow with the company. So other technological inventions that the store benefited from was, of course, the computer. And in 1963, Strawbridge Clothier was the first retailer in the city to actually have a computer, and they actually built an entire room to house this gigantic computer, which was used to process payroll data and print paychecks. And then in 1995, just 1 year before it was sold, it introduced online shopping. So there are also a lot of geographical changes that happened over the 128 years of doing business. As I mentioned, in 1868, we're coming off of the Civil War, and the local economy here actually was pretty good because Philadelphia had textile mills during the war that sold wool to the military for uniforms. So there was a lot of disposable income that Justice and Isaac could benefit from. And I mentioned also that you start to see this growth beyond the city limits into the emerging suburbs, and that, of course, would continue throughout the 20th century, definitely after World War II. Suburbs across America just, boomed. And Strawbridge Clothier, was watching this trend, and by 1930 decided to make a risky but calculated decision to open up its first branch store location, which was in Ardmore. And nationally, there were some department stores were beginning to branch out into the suburbs, not many, but a few. In Philadelphia, Strawbridge's was the first department store to do that, to branch out into the suburbs. And when I was reading about the Ardmore store, it's kind of funny because Ardmore, of course, is the heart of the main line, and the main line historically has a very affluent reputation, and certainly in 1930, there were a lot of wealthy families and big estates dotting the area, and that was the customer base for the Ardmore store. And it was not unusual for customers to arrive at the store from their riding clubs on horseback in their riding gear and to park their horses on the front lawn, and the doorman would tend to the horses while they went in and shopped. And there was actually a outdoor patio at that time where I guess the garden furniture was sold, and people would gather there and socialize. Oh, and if they didn't arrive on horseback, they oftentimes would arrive in their chauffeur-driven cars. And so the store acquired the nickname the Ardmore Club as a result. The second branch store would open up in 1931 in Jenkintown. And, but then we're moving into, the Depression and World War II, so the store did not open up any more branch locations until the mid-1950s, which was the Wilmington store. But definitely by the late 1950s, it became very clear to the store that its future was in branch stores. Most of the revenue was coming from branch store locations as opposed to the Center City store. So really from 1960 until 1990, the company opened up one new branch location every 2 to 3 years. So by the time it closed, or not closed, by the time it was sold, in 1996, there were a total of 13 branch store locations across the Delaware Valley. So Pennsylvania, southeastern eastern New Jersey, and Delaware. And in 1970, oh, there's the Jenkintown store, by the way. Some folks might remember that. In 1970, the company made another risky but calculated decision, which was to venture into the world of discount retail. And they decided to open up their first Clover store in Marlton, New Jersey. And there were other discount retailers in the Delaware Valley by 1970. There was Kmart and there was Burlington Coat Factory, but the market hadn't been saturated yet, and so Strawbridge is really always trying to stay ahead of the curve, and certainly ahead of their competitors, decided to venture into discount retail. So they opened up the Clover store, and it became successful pretty quickly. So throughout the 1970s and 80s, they opened up several more locations around the Delaware Valley. So by 1996, there were about 27 Clover stores. So I'm just going to ask, do folks here have a favorite? If you shopped at Strawbridge Clothier or Clover, do you have a favorite location that you remember shopping at? I went to the Ardmore store and King of Prussia. Yeah. Jenkintown, yeah. Anyone else? Center City. Springfield. All right. Center City. Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right. Yeah. So in addition to the geographical changes, the technological changes over these 128 years of doing business, there are also a lot of social changes that happened in the country at that time that retailers had to adapt to. And I talk in my book about the role of women in retail and also about segregation and discrimination, racial discrimination in the department store. And I say in my book that the golden age of the American department store could not have happened without women. And the golden age really was from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. It became very apparent to retailers, certainly I'd say by the 1880s, that women were making up their customer base. And actually, they used a nickname to describe them as Mrs. Consumer. And when I say women, I'm really specifically talking about white, middle, and upper class women, especially in an urban area. You know, prior to the advent of the American department store, women in this demographic, it was not socially acceptable for them to go outside of their homes alone and to shop alone. They had to be accompanied by typically a man. You know, it really was actually the men who did the shopping, or like I said, servants if they were wealthy. Women were expected to be in the house, taking care of the house, and were not expected to deal with money. So the department store really presented a socially acceptable space for women in this demographic to go on their own and shop and meet with their friends. And this is why we start to see department stores like Strawbridge's begin to make changes to their interiors to better accommodate Mrs. Consumer. So you see the introduction of more seating and women's lounges and restrooms. And Strawbridge's definitely made those adjustments during the 1880s and 1890s when it was expanding at the corner of 8th and Market Street. And you also see the opening up of formal tea rooms and dining rooms. You know, Wanamaker's had the Crystal Tea Room. Yeah. And Strawbridge Clothier had the Corinthian dining room, which I have some vague memories of having lunch there. And it really did feel special. You know, it was white table linens and uniformed waiters and waitresses. And, you know, they wanted people to come and sit and rest from all of their shopping and then continue to shop afterwards. And I did learn, actually, this might be the Quaker influence of the company, that in the Corinthian dining room, in any of the restaurants, in any of the branch locations, no alcohol was allowed to be sold. Not until, I think, the late 1970s. And certainly by then, I think the store, they had to compete with their competitors. And they recognized that if they sold alcohol, that would help with revenue. So, and there was also no alcohol allowed in advertisements either until, I think maybe until after World War II. But women also contributed to the success of department stores, not just as customers, but as employees. And again, I'm speaking specifically about white women, and I'll talk more about this later, but department stores certainly in the 19th century and early 20th century were not hiring non-white people in customer-facing positions. I learned that, sales staff, the position of sales staff became a socially acceptable form of employment for women. And I learned that in 1880, nationally, department stores across the country were employing just under 8,000 women, and predominantly in sales staff positions. And then just 10 years later, in 1890, they were employing over 58,000 women. So there was just phenomenal growth here, and department stores clearly were emerging as just providing a ton of economic opportunity for women. And just like department stores started to make changes to their interiors to accommodate Mrs. Consumer, they also started to make changes to better accommodate all these women employees, women sales staff. And so you see the introduction of employee lounges. And this is a rooftop deck that was turned into an employee lounge for women sales staff at Strawbridge's, probably around 1910, I want to guess. And you can see some women, resting their feet, because the position of being a sales staff person is, retail in general is physically demanding. You're on your feet for a lot of hours. And so being able to have proper breaks and a place to go was very important. So Strawbridge's opened up employee lounges, employee cafeterias, locker rooms during this time. And certainly the position of sales staff, the majority of sales staff positions at Strawbridge Clothier would be held by women for most of its history. By the middle of the 20th century, about half of the buyers, and a buyer was considered an executive level position, were women by the middle of the 20th century. But it really wouldn't be until the 1970s that more opportunities opened up for women within the higher ranks of the company. In 1976, the company promoted a woman to be vice president of merchandise. So that was Natalie Weintraub, who's pictured in the center. So she was the first vice president at Strawbridge Clothier, first woman vice president. And then in 1977, the woman pictured on the far right, her name is Deborah Farragher. She was promoted to be the first woman store manager, and that was of the Ardmore store. And definitely during the 1970s and 80s, more women were moving into store manager positions and divisional director positions. In 1984, the company would nominate 2 women for the first time to sit on its board of directors. And that was Margaret Clues, who's on the right, and Nancy Longstreth on the left. Yeah. So like I said, the 70s and definitely the decade of the 80s was a decade of growth. But still, there was room for more progress. And by 1996, when the company was sold, there were still just 2 out of 18 corporate officers who are women, and just 3 out of 13 board members who are women. So there's still room for growth there. I also look at discrimination and segregation in the department store, and I ask the question, were non-white employees fully considered part of the store family during much of its history? And I would say no, not until after World War II, were there real efforts to better integrate the store family. Prior to the post-World War II era, Did the company try to recognize contributions of non-white employees? They did in their own way, looking at early issues of the Store Chat magazine, which was a monthly magazine that was distributed to all the employees. If you go back and look at early issues, and when I say early, I mean like 1906, 1908, there were some articles that highlighted the contributions of some Black employees, and the company also hosted an annual breakfast for the housekeeping staff, pictured here on the left, who were predominantly Black women. But when looking at any photographs of like the employee clubs and organizations from those early years, it was predominantly white faces that I saw. There also were articles in the Store Chat magazine from those early years that relied on, racist cartoons and racist tropes. There were also, I think I skipped over this picture, minstrel groups, employee minstrel groups, a men's minstrel group and a women's minstrel group, which actually I wasn't aware that minstrel groups were pretty popular within department stores. They would perform for customers and employees for special events. And minstrelsy was a really popular form of entertainment in this country from the mid-1800s to the 1920s. But really, it was employee discriminatory practices that I think prevented a lot of non-white employees from feeling like they were truly part of the store family. And as I mentioned, there were no non-white employees who were hired to be in customer-facing positions. They predominantly held roles in the warehouse, the kitchen staff, housekeeping staff. One exception would be elevator porters, who were predominantly Black men. This was taken from an early Store Chat magazine. But even they were not expected to actually interact with the predominantly white customer base. So I look at some grassroots organizing and activism that took place right here in Philadelphia after World War II by a group of nonprofit organizations that came together and formed a coalition. They included organizations like the American Friends Service Committee, the NAACP of Pennsylvania, the Women's International League, and gosh, there were a lot, actually. I think one other was the American Jewish Congress. So they all got together and they formed what was called a Committee on Fair Employment Practices in Department Stores. So they really wanted to focus on the big department stores here in Philadelphia and try to encourage them to start hiring Black women specifically as sales staff. And they felt like if we could focus on the big department stores and encourage them to make that change in their employment policies, then they could be a model for other industries. So they spent between 1945 and 1948 going around and meeting with all the heads of the big department stores, including Strawbridge Clothier, trying to encourage them to actually hire Black saleswomen. And the response was largely no, including from Strawbridge Clothier. The reason being that they were fearful that their predominantly white customer base would be uncomfortable engaging with Black sales staff. So it wouldn't be until 1948, about February of that year, when the city of Philadelphia actually passed a city Fair Employment Practices Ordinance. After that legislation passed, then department stores started to hire Black sales staff, including Strawbridge Clothier, in 1948. The next couple of decades, though, progress would be a little slow, and it really wouldn't be until after 1964, when the Civil Rights Act passed, that the company really made more of an effort to hire more non-white people in customer-facing positions. And then by the 1970s, the company established a formal anti-discrimination policy, and definitely in the 1980s and 70s, more non-white people are employed in customer-facing positions. And if you look through issues of the store chat magazines from those decades, you see more inclusion in the employee clubs and organizations as well. But even during this time when the company was really trying to integrate more, it faced resistance both from inside and outside. And certainly there are older white employees who were resistant to this change, and also customers too. And in my book, I include information about a customer in Bucks County, Clover, was opening up a new store in a neighborhood in Bucks County. And the vice president of personnel for Clover at that time received a letter from someone who lived in the neighborhood who was very concerned that Clover was coming in because they knew that Clover hired a lot of black people. And they were concerned that they were going to want to rent houses and buy homes in the neighborhood. So, you know, I learned a lot when I was researching this section because I didn't quite realize the role that department stores had in the early civil rights movement. And if this is something you're interested in, I really relied on a book called Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement by Tracy Parker. It was really fascinating. So I'd like to now look at some other ways in which the store family culture grew and was fostered throughout the company's history. So it was very important for Justice and Isaac to create a community that employees would want to return to day after day, that they would want to grow with the company, like I mentioned with the young 13 and 14-year-old boys who were hired by the company. They would want to remain with the company, and that was true for all employees that the company hired. You know, the thinking was if employees were happy, then the customer would be happy. You know, if the employees want to keep returning to work here, then customers are going to want to keep returning to shop here. And the company, like I said, started with just 30 employees, and ended in 1996 with approximately 15,000 employees. So they were one of the largest employers in the Delaware Valley at that time. And maintaining this store family culture was increasingly important to the company as it grew during those decades, especially when they were opening up branch store locations, you know, locations that were pretty far from the center city location. So it was really important to keep the employees connected. And one way to do this was through employee-led clubs and organizations. And Justice and Isaac supported the creation of several different employee clubs, many of which continued throughout the existence of the company. And I talk about a lot of different employee clubs in my book, but I'll just highlight a few with you now. The most popular one was the Athletic Association. So in 1910, the company actually purchased an athletic field at 67th Walnut and Locust Streets. So the company purchased the field, but the employees formed the Athletic Association that was made up of several different sports teams, baseball being one. And then the next year, the company built a indoor gymnasium next to the athletic field, and that had basketball courts in it, and I think indoor volleyball was played there. There were men's and women's locker rooms, so the Athletic Association was for men and women. And the sporting events just became very popular and just became real social events. So after games, quite often, people would stick around, and they'd have picnic dinners, and there'd be dancing and music. And actually, at the first baseball game that the Athletic Association had, there were over 3,000 people who attended. Unfortunately, by the early 1920s, the company had to sell the athletic field and the gymnasium because they just became too expensive to maintain. And by that time, the company had become incorporated also, so they had to answer to shareholders. But the Athletic Association continued up until 1996, and a lot of employees who I spoke to had really fond memories of attending the softball games and said that they were just really big, popular events. Justice and Isaac was actually quoted as saying early on that he and Justice believed in the necessity of outdoor activity for those who worked indoors, which I thought that was a good quote. Another popular club, employee club, was the Strawbridge Clothier Chorus. And, oh, actually, I have a couple of fun photographs here so this is one of the early baseball teams. I guess they represented the merchandise division. And then this one I love showing. So that's the women's basketball team. I mean, can you imagine running up and down a basketball court wearing that? And they look thrilled, don't they? Yeah. At different times. So the Strawbridge Clothier store, the chorus, that formed in 1904, and there were about 100 people who signed up for it in its first year. It became very popular and remained very popular throughout the history of the company. And actually, it developed a really good reputation around Philadelphia. There were articles and reviews written in the newspaper about their performances. They performed at the Academy of Music and Willow Grove Park, as well as within the store for special events for customers and employees. By the 1960s, 70s, they weren't performing at those venues, those big venues anymore, and they really became the store's goodwill ambassador and performed at like veterans associations and senior centers and of course during the holiday season for customers. And then there was the Quarter Century Club, and that formed in 1908 by employees to honor fellow employees who had worked for the company for 25 years. And they decided to have an annual dinner banquet to honor employees who became members of the Quarter Century Club. And it was a fun event, formal dinner with speakers and a band and dancing. I have a foggy memory of going to, I think it was the Quarter Century Club event for my dad when he became a member, and it was a really fun event. But there was also a special luncheon later on that developed for people who worked for the company for 50 years. It's pretty exceptional. And I actually came across in my research this menu from the very first Quarter Century Club annual banquet, which I think is just fun to look at to see what was on the dinner menu in 1908. Yeah. I know, yeah. That would have been in Strawbridge's, yeah. What's on here? Oh, squab. I always ask people, do you know what roast squab is? Pigeon, yeah. Yum. So the fact that there was a Quarter Century Club and, like I said, a luncheon for people who worked for the company for 50 years, I think really demonstrates the influence of the store family culture. And the fact that so many employees throughout the company's history made Strawbridge & Clothier their lifelong career. I mean, granted, that was more common a century ago. Today, it's pretty hard to find someone who has stayed with the same company for their entire career. But nonetheless, I think it is remarkable to see how dedicated some employees were. And I like to end by sharing with you a few folks who I came across in my research who were some of the longest serving employees at the company. And one man, his name is Herbert Tiley, and he worked for the company for 69 years. He started in 1879 when he was 13 or 14, so he was a cash boy. And he retired in 1944. And what do you think his position was when he retired? No. President. He was president. Yeah, and he was just an incredible person who I I had never heard of this man before. And not only was he president of the company, but he came up with the idea of the seal of confidence, of Clover Day sales. That was his idea. Of some of the employee training programs that were developed in the 19-teens. He recognized that need to start formally training employees. That really didn't come into being in this country until the 19-teens. What else? Oh, I don't know. Oh, he helped start the chorus. He was a musician on the side, you know. Yeah, just an amazing person. And then another person was Wilfred Keeley. He worked for the company for 44 years, and he started in 1865. So before Strawbridge Clothier opened, he worked for Justice's small dry goods company. And he was a soldier in the Civil War, and the war ended, and he was looking for a job. And Justice hired him, and he didn't even have a place to stay. So Justice let him sleep in the store for, I don't know, the first several months. And he later became the president of the Quarter Century Club. And then finally, Mary Byrne. She worked for the company for 65 years. And she started in 1929, and retired in 1994. But when she retired, she was the only employee who had actually worked in the old store. So before the store that we see today on the corner of 8th and Market Street, she worked in the store prior to that. And she was the only employee who worked in the same position for the entirety of her career. She worked in the stationery department here at 8th and Market Street. Yeah, she was stationary. Yeah, towards the end, yeah. Mm-hmm. So it was just really fun to learn about all these people. Actually, anyone here who worked for Strawbridge Clothier, were you a member of the Quarter Century Club? No. 4 years. Oh, okay, so not quite, yeah. Well, sadly, Strawbridge Clothier's good times would only last for so long. And by the 1990s, the retail marketplace had changed drastically from the golden era of the department store. And in order for Strawbridge Clothier to keep trying to compete, it would have to make drastic changes that would alter those original founding values of integrity and character, which would not only impact customers, but employees. So they made the very difficult decision to sell to the May Company. And the stores, the department stores, would operate under Hex for several years. And the Clover stores were purchased by Kimco Realty, and many of them turned into Kohl's stores. And then in 2005, all of the Strawbridge's/Hex stores became Macy's stores. And actually, I just learned recently from a member here who told me that in 2006, the 8th and Market store underwent a very large historic preservation project. Yes, Sherman, right? Yes. And it also became a LEED certified building as well. So I was not aware of that. And today, on the ground floor of the building, it's now occupied by a giant heirloom market. And, oh no, did it already close? I was just informed that it was, Well, they did. I mean, I remember when they opened just a few years ago, because they kept a lot of the original features of the store. The gold chandeliers and the boar fountain is still there. And then I'll show you. The boar fountain and the elevator lobby. Oh, well, okay, so yeah, it's not anymore. Well, we'll see what might occupy that space in the future. But anyhow, these photos you can see on the right, that's the Corinthian dining room. And then, of course, the food hall, which I did not have time to talk about the food hall, but I'm sure folks here might have some good memories of shopping in the food hall. Yeah. So I will end my talk here and open it up to any questions. Yeah.
I don't have a question.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. I have a picture of one of those cards in my book. Yeah. Oh, great. There was someone in the back?
Yes, I wondered, as a shopper at Strawbridge, it seemed to me the women, it was women back in the 60s,
Yeah.
and they were so knowledgeable about their product line and whatever area they were working in. I was wondering, was there a formal training program to make them know more about lamps or irons or whatever it was?
Yes, yeah. There was, yeah. Well, like I said, beginning in the 19 teens, the company started developing employee training programs. Several different employee training programs, including one for people who wanted to be a buyer. And that was called the Executive Development Program, I think. And it was a 9-month-long program where you would attend workshops and classes, and they would bring in guest speakers. Yeah, and so you got your training about what was involved with being a buyer and knowing the merchandise. And then from there, once you completed that 9-month-long program, you went through, it really was like a 3 or 4 year process before you actually became a full-fledged buyer. So yeah, quite a bit of time went into training and familiarizing, especially the sales. So the buyer would then train the sales staff in the merchandise. Yeah. Yes.
I'm not from here, so I really, I wasn't around when the store was open. But I heard an interesting fact about, John Wanamaker. Now, John Wanamaker was open,
Yeah, so John Wanamaker, he opened his first store, I believe it was around 1861 when Justice opened his first store. And then Wanamaker's built the Grand Depot, the much bigger store. I'm not too sure when that opened. I want to say maybe in the 1870s. I'm not too sure.
but I was told that that he invented the price tag.
No. No. Oh. Oh, yes, so she said that she heard that John Wanamaker invented the price tag. So, okay, maybe I shouldn't be so quick to say no. He was our big competitor, so. What I learned was the idea of actually placing a price on goods and eliminating haggling came from Alexander Turney Stewart, who was considered the father of the American department store. He opened up a store in New York in 1830, something like that. It was a small dry goods store, but it became quite popular. So then I think by the 1850s, he had a big store, big department store. And he introduced that idea of just eliminating haggling and setting one price for the goods. Yeah, because prior to that, you would go shopping, again, typically the men who went shopping, and you didn't know you didn't know what the prices were, so you'd have to haggle. If you knew the shopkeeper, hey, maybe he'll give you a good deal, but if you didn't know the shopkeeper, you don't know the quality of the goods, yeah, it was just a very different experience. So that idea was already out there in the universe by the time Isaac and Justice opened up Strawbridge's and Wanamaker, too. And this was interesting. That concept really appealed to John Wanamaker and Justice and Isaac, because they were the first ones in Philadelphia to introduce it, because they were religious men. Isaac and Justice were Quakers. John Wanamaker was a very religious man. I'm not too sure, he wasn't a Quaker. Was he a Quaker? I didn't think he was. I thought he was like Protestant or something. I don't know. Yeah. But that really appealed to them. Again, those values that they had of integrity, fairness. And John Wanamaker was quoted as saying something like, you know, if men are equal before God, like, then something like, then good should be equal. Oh, I'm totally botching it. I wish I had it written down. Oh, it might be in my book, actually. I might pull it out. Anyhow, I just thought that was really interesting. The religious, you know, convictions of businessmen.
I don't know if this is true, but
Integrity,
he
yeah.
said that even though he was also a very, very religious man,
Yeah.
he would take his staff out like every Friday night to McGillen's.
Really? I didn't know that. That's very interesting. I'm gonna have to look for. I'm gonna try to find that quote. Oh well, I don't know, and I don't. You know, maybe. I know. I quickly was like, no, John Wanamaker did not invent that. Maybe something about the actual tag. Maybe that was his idea. I don't know.
But it seemed like before that, they used to size the customer up
Yes.
and have an idea of what the customer could pay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but they both started at
Around the same time.
same price tags at the same time.
Yes, that is correct. Okay, yes.
So you showed the seal of approval, like, it looked like maybe it was like a tile mosaic
Yeah.
type thing. But I remember, like, as a kid, like, there was an area of the store, I don't know if it was like in the bottom where the gallery was, where they had like giant marble relief, like white marble, and it was carved.
Yes.
What happened to those?
Well, that's a really good question. There, I mean, some of them are quite large. So the picture I showed you, you're right, that was tile. And that was inside the elevator. So these elevators, each one had a tile image of the seal of confidence. And when the store was sold, we have one, yeah. Certain members of the family were able to take the tile seal of confidence. So my parents have one actually, but yes, I've been asked that question a lot, especially with the branch store locations. People have asked me, what happened to the big seal of confidence? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wonder if, I know that Drexel University does have a certain amount of Strawbridge Clothier objects, so perhaps they have some of those. Yeah. And that's it. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you again for everyone joining us today. Meg is going to be signing books. I don't need to remind everyone, Thanksgiving is over, the holidays are nearly upon us. What makes a great gift? A book. So, hat tip to Head House Books for the book sales, and I'm sure they'll be happy to chat with you more about Strawbridge Clothier. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I was going to tell everyone this story, but in the 1990s, Stockton and I worked on a project. He was absolutely avid about Market Street East being redone. He and I met many, many times in the private dining room, but the first time we met, the strangest thing happened. Do you know what floor the private executive dining room was on at Meg's store?
Well, the printing room.
It's the same printing.
Oh, yeah, the sixth floor. Right?
Exactly. I'm leaving the meeting, and he's following me. I'm going down the escalator, and he's still behind me. I'm going down the next floor. He's still behind me. He walked me to the front door as if it was his home, and then said goodbye. I could not believe it. Okay, that's my story.
That's really nice. Thank you for sharing.